was born in a small wooden house on the edge of a farming town, somewhere in the middle of America. My parents were poor, though at the time I didn't fully understand what that meant. To me, the creaking floorboards, the patched clothes, and the empty cupboards were normal. My father worked with his hands every day, plowing the fields and fixing wagons for neighbors, while my mother sewed and mended until her eyes ached. We never had enough money, but we had enough to live. At least, that's what they always told me when my stomach growled at night. As a child, I often dreamed of more. When I saw the wagons passing through town, with shiny wheels and families dressed in finer clothes than we had, I would imagine myself riding in one of them, leaving the dust of our town behind. I wasn't ungrateful, but something inside me longed for more than just survival. I wanted to be free from the constant worry that tomorrow we might not have food on the table. My first lessons in hardship came early. By the time I was 10, I was working alongside my father. While other children played, I carried water buckets, cut wood, and learned to bargain with farmers at the market. At the time, I thought life was unfair. But years later, I would realize those were the very skills that taught me discipline, patience, and the courage to keep pushing forward, even when the odds seemed stacked against me. One winter was especially harsh. Our crops failed, and there wasn't enough money for coal. We burned broken furniture to keep warm. I remember lying awake, watching my mother's face lit by the dim fire, her hands wrapped in cloth because they were raw from sewing late into the night. That was the moment I promised myself something. I didn't say it aloud, but deep down, I swore I would never let myself or my future family suffer like that again. I would find a way to rise above. And as I grew older, I started to see that opportunities rarely came knocking. If I wanted change, I had to chase it. At 16, I left home. It was not an easy decision. My mother cried quietly when she packed me a small bundle of bread and dried meat, and my father simply said, "Work hard. Keep your word. That's all a man has." Those were the last words he spoke to me before I walked down the dirt road with nothing but determination in my chest. The world outside our little town was bigger than I imagined. I walked for days, sometimes trading chores for a place to sleep in barns, sometimes going hungry when there was nothing to spare. I learned quickly that nobody handed out kindness without reason, and even when they did, you had to be humble enough to accept it. My first job was as a helper at a mill. I swept floors, carried sacks heavier than myself, and earned just enough coins to keep from starving. Still, each night I told myself this was only the beginning. I repeated it like a prayer. This is not the end. This is only the beginning. Looking back now, I realized that my greatest wealth at that time wasn't money. It was hunger. Hunger not only for food, but for a better life. That hunger pushed me through long hours and aching muscles. It forced me to watch and learn. When the mill owner argued with merchants, I listened closely. When repairs were made to the grinding wheels, I paid attention. Knowledge, I discovered, was everywhere, free for the taking if you kept your eyes open. But there were failures too. Once, I saved nearly every coin I earned for months to buy a small cart, hoping to start a delivery service. The very first week, the cart broke down on a muddy road, and everything I had worked for was lost. I cried in the dark that night, ashamed and angry. But when morning came, I got back up. That was another lesson. Failure is not the end. It is only a teacher, and often the harshest one. Years passed, and I moved from job to job, farmhand, carpenter's apprentice, and sometimes even a peddler of small goods. Each role gave me something new, even if at the time it felt like nothing more than survival. I saved coins when I could, though most of the time it slipped through my hands faster than I could gather it. Still, I never forgot that winter in my childhood, and that promise I made to myself. It was the fire that kept me going. When I was about 20, I found myself in a bustling town near the river. It was larger than any place I had ever been, full of noise, wagons, and the smell of opportunity. Men shouted about business deals, shops displayed goods I had never seen, and workers swarmed the docks carrying crates from boats that came from faraway lands. For the first time, I felt the pulse of what people called prosperity. I wanted to be part of it, though I had no idea how. One evening, I sat on the steps of a tavern, my hands blistered from unloading cargo all day. A man sat beside me, older and dressed in worn clothes, but his eyes were sharp. He asked me about my work, and I told him everything. He listened quietly, then said something I never forgot. "Son, the difference between staying poor and getting ahead is not just how hard you work, but how smart you use what little you have." Those words struck me like lightning. Until then, I believed muscle and sweat were enough. But maybe, just maybe, I needed to think differently. That night, I couldn't sleep. His words spun in my head. Work smart, not just hard. But how? I had nothing. No land, no tools, barely enough to eat. Yet I realized something important. I had myself, my hands, my back, my eyes, and my mind. And perhaps, if I could learn to see what others overlooked, I could find my way. That was the start of my journey. I didn't know it then, but from that moment, my life began to change. Slowly, painfully, but surely. I woke before sunrise most days, because the river woke first. The fog would hang low, and the boats slid in almost silently, noses bumping the dock posts, men calling to one another in tired voices. At the mill, I had learned to lift with my legs and not my back, and on the docks that kept me safe. I carried sacks, rolled barrels with a pry bar, and did what I was told. It was honest work, and it kept me fed. But I knew it would not carry me far. I kept my eyes open for something others ignored. The small openings that the older man's words had pointed me toward. Use what little you have and use it wisely. The first opening was no more than a whisper of an idea. I noticed how the wagons that brought flour to town often left empty. A driver would pat his horse, spit into the dust, and start back to the farms with nothing in the bed but the ruts of the boards. Empty wagons made no money. I began to ask questions in a way that would not annoy. Where are you headed after you drop? Do you pass Miller's Lane on your way back? Would you carry a few bundles if I had them ready? Some laughed at me. A few shrugged and said, maybe. I had nothing to offer them but small coins and reliability, so I started there. I walked the streets in the evening and listened to shopkeepers. Many complained that simple things ran out at the wrong time. Kerosene wicks, nails, salt, kindling. People would come in, stand with their hats in their hands, and leave empty because the shipment had not arrived yet. I could not buy a shipment, but I could buy a handful. So I took the few coins I had and bought a small sack of nails from a store near the docks where they were cheaper. I took them to a street farther inland where prices were higher and the owner was out. I did not try to take a great profit. I asked for a small margin, and I promised I could bring more the next week if he needed. He looked at me like he was not sure whether to trust me, but he needed nails. He paid. I walked back to my room with a few extra coins in my pocket and a feeling in my chest like a seed had caught and put out a tiny root. I kept a small notebook under my mattress, a cheap thing with rough paper. Every coin I earned and spent went in there. At first it seemed pointless. The numbers were low and the lines thin. But each night the entries gave me a kind of quiet. I was no longer walking in the dark. I could see, even if the sight was not yet pretty. I recorded the nails and the cost of the sack and the price I charged and the wagon fee I paid the driver for the back trip. There was not much left over, but there was something. That something meant the idea was not foolish. I learned that small trades fail for silly reasons. One week I had paid for 2 sacks of nails, only to find the inland shop had already received a late shipment and did not need mine. I stood there holding the rough cloth of the sacks, feeling like a fool, until I noticed a carpenter across the street helping his boy load a wheelbarrow. I asked if he needed nails. He eyed me, then asked what I was charging. He knew the price on the river was lower, and he tried to press me down to almost nothing. I swallowed my pride and took the deal anyway, and I walked away with a thin profit instead of a loss. That afternoon, I wrote in my notebook that pride is expensive and that the market does not care about my plans. I underlined it twice. In those days, I slept in a narrow room behind a bakery. The walls held the smell of yeast and ash all night long. The baker's wife allowed me to read by their kitchen fire if I finished my chores. She had a cousin who ran a dry goods store, and one night she pressed a thin book into my hands. It was a guide to basic accounts, written in plain language with examples about chalk and sugar and cloth. I read it twice, then started to copy its ideas into my notebook. I learned to think in terms of turn and float, though I did not know those fancy words. I learned that a coin sitting idle is a coin asleep, and that the faster I could move it from buy to sell and back again, the more it could grow, like a field planted twice if the season allowed. The dock clerk, a narrow man with ink on his fingers, noticed I stood nearby when loads were listed on the chalkboard. He liked to talk. Most had no patience for his words, but I did, because information was cheap to collect and dear to own. He told me which boats were steady and which captains were late to pay, which merchants argued over pennies and which would meet a fair man halfway. He also told me about the times cargo was left unclaimed because a buyer's horse had gone lame or a storm had washed out a bridge. Those left behind crates could sometimes be bought at a discount if you had cash ready and a spine for risk. I did not have much cash, but I had a bit, and I had a spine that had learned to carry sacks. The first time I took such a chance, my hands shook. A crate of lamp wicks was sitting near the edge of the dock. The buyer had not come. The clerk muttered that by sunset it would go to whoever could pay a fair offer, as the boat needed to clear space. I made my offer, not bold but not timid, and by the end of the day, the crate was mine. I knew a boarding house that always ran out of wicks on cold nights. I walked there with the crate on a borrowed cart. The owner was a stern woman who counted every coin twice. She tapped the crate with her boot and said she would not pay what the store charged. I told her I could go lower if she would take the whole lot for the month and pay half now and half in 2 weeks. She frowned. I stood still and kept my breath even. She agreed. When I left her door, the cart was empty, my pockets were heavier, and my mind was racing with the possibilities of selling in bundles instead of ones. Not every day brought a win. A sudden storm swelled the river, and a shipment of salt that I had partly paid for arrived soaked. The sacks wept brine through the seams, and the shop that had promised to buy would not touch them. I thought I could dry the salt by spreading it on tarps behind the bakery. I worked until my fingers cracked, turning the crystals with a wooden spoon. Then the clouds opened again and washed half of it into the earth. That night, the baker's wife brought me a bowl of stew and did not say a word. I wrote in my notebook that nature does not bargain and that I must not risk more than I can afford to lose on any one deal. After that, I began to split my small coins across 2 or 3 different goods whenever I could. Trust turned out to be the most valuable thing I could own. I never cheated on weight. I never hid a chip in a barrel head. If I could not deliver, I said so early. If I promised a time, I showed up before the clock struck. Sometimes that meant I made less money than a faster talker. But it also meant that the shopkeepers would see me and relax their shoulders, and they would say yes without haggling quite so hard because they knew the goods would come and the ledger would match the word. In a town full of men trying to climb over one another, a steady hand can earn a place. In the second year by the river, I rented a small shed near the warehouse row. It had a warped door and gaps between the planks. When it rained, the sound was a drum above my head. But it was mine for a few coins a month, and I could store small lots without rushing them to buyers the same day. That shed changed my days. I no longer lived only from load to load. I could watch prices for a week and wait for a better moment. I could buy kindling in bulk when the woodcutters came down early in the season and then sell it in small bundles at a fair price when the nights turned cold. I kept a broom and a scale and a little desk inside. And when I locked that door at night, I felt like I was locking up more than wood and rope. I was guarding proof that my life was turning a corner. I made mistakes with people too. There was a driver named Eli who was quick with a smile and quicker with excuses. He claimed he could carry my crates to 3 shops in a morning for half the cost of the other drivers. I agreed, greedy for the savings. He took my goods and returned at dusk with only 2 deliveries done and a story about a lame wheel. I was short on time and full of anger, so I shouted at him in the street, which helped no one. He never worked for me again, and the next week I had to mend the relationship with the 3rd shopkeeper, who had waited for a delivery that never came. I learned to set expectations in writing, even if that writing was only a simple note with a date and a list and both our names at the bottom. A written promise steadies the weakest memory. One quiet habit did more for me than almost anything else. Every Sunday afternoon, I sat in the shed with my notebook and copied the week. What sold fast? What sat? Which prices moved? Which faces were easy to deal with and which were thorny? I tried to describe the patterns like I was speaking to a future version of myself who had not yet lived this week. The first time I did it, I filled only a page. After a few months, I could flip back and see that lamp wicks always rose after the first cold snap and that nails sold best the week after the riverboats brought in lumber crews. I began to buy just ahead of those moments. It felt like cheating, but it was only paying attention. There were people who helped me climb. The dock clerk, with his ink-stained fingers, pointed me to small auctions when merchants defaulted. The baker's wife pressed books into my hands, and when her husband fell sick for a spell, I woke early to help knead dough before running to the docks. A church elder introduced me to a cooper who sold barrels at an honest price if you bought 3 at a time. Each person put a plank under my boot, and I tried in return to be useful in small ways that required more muscle than money. I lifted flour in the bakery. I repaired a broken latch at the clerk's boarding room. I carried water for the elder when the pump stuck. I learned that generosity does not always wear the clothes of coins. The shed grew too small. I did not leap to a grand store. That would have been a costume my life could not yet carry. Instead, I rented the front half of a stall near the market square on a trial basis. Half a stall meant half the rent and half the pride, but it placed me where the footsteps were. I arranged my goods by need. The front table held what sells fast and often, the little things people forget they need until the moment they do. The back held the heavier items that required conversation. I kept my voice level and my prices clear. When a man tried to beat me down for sport, I smiled and stood firm. When a widow came with 3 children and not enough coins for kerosene, I sold at cost and wrote the reason in the margin of my ledger without calling it charity. It was a kind of banking with the town's goodwill, and the interest paid out in return business I could not have bought with any advertisement. Once, after a long day, I counted my coins and made a mistake. I thought I had more than I did. The next morning, I paid a supplier and found my purse thin before the week was out. I had to walk to a man who lent at harsh rates and borrow enough to meet a promise. The interest ate me like termites, slow and sure. I repaid it and wrote on the first page of my notebook that paper mistakes become flesh and blood pains, and that my numbers must be right before my words leave my mouth. From then on, I counted twice and had someone else, when possible, count with me. What I learned most in those years was that wealth is built from habits long before it is stacked in coins. Rising early, even when tired. Checking the weather and planning deliveries on dry mornings. Keeping a calm face in front of a sharp buyer. Buying 2 when my mind screamed to buy 10, so that a bad turn could not break me. Saying thank you to the boy who swept my stall and teaching him how to weigh nails fairly. The quiet care of these things made the loud moments possible. On a late autumn evening, the river like black glass and the air smelling of chimney smoke, I stood in my stall and watched the town move. A farmer argued over seed prices 2 doors down. A girl laughed as her father tried on a new hat and pretended to be a grand judge. A sailor rolled his shoulders after a long trip. I looked at the shelves I had built from discarded planks, the scales that now sat heavy and sure, the small lockbox that held my week's earnings. I thought of the boy who left home with a bundle of bread and a vow in his chest. I did not yet feel rich, not by the measures of the men who owned warehouses and called orders from tall desks. But I felt something better than the hunger I knew as a child. I felt a steadiness, a sense that the ground under my feet belonged in part to me because I had earned my place upon it. I went back to the shed that night and opened my notebook. I copied a lesson for the future again. Work teaches you where the money hides. Attention teaches you when to reach for it. Character decides who will still trade with you when you make a mistake. I closed the book and set it beneath my pillow as if it were a brick I could sleep on, to raise my head a little higher by morning. In the weeks that followed, I started to think about one step I had avoided because it frightened me. The town's freight men were scattered and unorganized, each taking the jobs that came through gossip and chance. Delays were common, tempers short, and goods often late. I began to wonder if a small office with a slate board, a clock, and a promise could bring order to the mess. Merchants could post needs, drivers could claim them, and a small fee would come to the one who kept the slate and kept his word. It would not require heavy capital, only discipline, fairness, and a willingness to stand between 2 sides and be trusted by both. I had spent years building those exact muscles. On the first morning of winter, I wiped my breath from the stall window and wrote a note in chalk where everyone could see. Reliable freight matching inside. Fair fees, clear times. No favor for friends over the posted line. Then I fastened a small bell to the door, took a breath that felt like the crisp bite of the season, and waited for the first ring. The bell over the stall door rang for the first time the very next morning. I had written the sign in chalk with a steady hand, but I still half expected no one to come. The bell startled me. A man in a wool coat stepped in, the smell of horses still on him, and he asked in a blunt voice if I really meant what the sign promised. I told him I did. He wanted 3 crates taken across town by noon. I asked which driver he usually used. He said whoever was standing by the square. I pointed to the slate board and explained that he could post the need and a driver could claim it, and I would make sure the time was kept. He frowned, but his eyes softened when I said I would stand responsible for delays. He scrawled the order on the board. Before the sun was high, a driver carried his crates, and by noon he had his delivery. He returned the next day with 2 more orders. That was the seat of my freight office. It was no more than a half stall, a slate, and a bell, but it gave shape to the chaos. At first, only small merchants used it, but soon the larger shops noticed that goods moved faster through my stall than by waiting for gossip to bring a driver. The board began to fill. I had to mark times and wipe the slate clean each morning. I charged a thin fee, enough to cover the board and my labor, but not so high that anyone could say I was greedy. The real value was trust, and I had spent years building it like a mason lays bricks. Managing goods had taught me numbers, but managing people required another kind of wisdom. Drivers did not like rules. They wanted to haggle each trip. Merchants wanted promises that no man alive could always keep. I stood between them with my word as my only shield. When a driver failed to show, I paid half the loss myself and noted his name on the side of the slate for a week so all could see. When a merchant tried to delay payment, I reminded him of the order he had written in chalk with his own hand. It was not easy. Some shouted, some stormed out, but many returned because order is like clean water, hard to value until you taste it after a drought. Winter tested us all. Snow clogged the roads and horses struggled through the drifts. Goods piled up at the docks. People grew short-tempered as firewood thinned and kerosene ran low. My little system bent under the weight. Orders stacked faster than drivers could carry. Merchants banged on my stall door demanding answers. I could have hidden, but I did not. Each morning I stood by the board and explained the truth. The roads are closed here. The bridge is iced there. These 3 orders will move today. These 5 tomorrow. I paid drivers extra out of my own pocket to push through the worst nights, and I walked beside them when wagons stuck, shoulder to wheel, until they rolled free. One night, I returned to my shed so cold that my fingers barely bent. I lit a stub of candle and looked at my notebook. The ink had frozen in the well. I scratched with a blunt pencil instead, writing that leadership means carrying more than your share when the load grows heavy. That winter burned the lesson into my bones. By spring, the town knew my bell. Merchants planned their shipments around my board. Drivers came first to me before wandering the square. My fee was still small, but the volume had grown, and with it my savings. For the first time in my life, I held coins enough that I could think beyond the next week. I thought of my parents, still on their farm, still patching clothes and burning chairs in hard winters. I thought of the boy who left home with bread in a bundle and nothing else. I smiled to myself and said quietly, "You are on the path." But pride can make a man stumble. That summer I tried to expand too quickly. A merchant offered me a chance to handle a shipment far larger than any I had touched before. It promised more profit than a season of my usual work. I agreed without thought, spent nearly all my savings to secure drivers, wagons, and storage space. Then the river flooded. Boats were delayed, roads washed out, and half the goods spoiled before they reached town. I stood in my stall as the merchant shouted at me, his fingers stabbing the air, and I could only bow my head. My notebook later recorded it plain. I mistook ambition for readiness. The debt pressed me down for months. I cut my own meals, wore the same coat until the seams split, and worked longer hours to repay what I owed. It was bitter, but I did not give up the office. I could not. The bell still rang, and each ring reminded me that my reputation was my lifeline. Slowly, coin by coin, I paid back what I had lost. The lesson cost me dearly. But it taught me that growth must be steady, not reckless. As the third year ended, I no longer feared hunger. My notebook held thicker pages, filled with patterns of trade and the stories of my failures and recoveries. My stall had become a place where merchants and drivers trusted the chalk more than their own memories. And in my chest, there was a quiet pride. Not the loud pride that blinds, but the calm pride of a man who has walked through storm and still stands. I began to dream again. Not just of survival, not just of small coins, but of building something lasting, something that would not vanish with the next flood or storm. I did not know yet what form it would take, but I knew this. I had learned to turn hunger into discipline, failure into teaching, and chaos into order. And those three together are the roots of fortune. I still remember the morning I unlocked the stall and found two merchants waiting at the door before the bell could ring. One wanted flour carried upriver, the other needed barrels of cider hauled down to the docks. Both spoke at once, both impatient, both pressing coins into my palm as if speed could be bought by shoving harder. I realized in that moment that my small slate and single hand could no longer hold all the strands of trade crossing through town. My office had grown larger than me. That thought filled me with both pride and fear. I hired my first clerk not long after. His name was Thomas, a wiry fellow with a neat hand and a sharp tongue. He had been sweeping floors at a boarding house and leapt at the chance to earn a steady wage indoors. At first, I hovered over him, checking each line he chalked on the board, each coin he counted into the box. But soon, I saw he had a memory for faces and a patience for arguments that matched my own. With Thomas at the board, I could step back and think about what lay beyond today's deliveries. The town itself was swelling. New warehouses rose near the river, and a sawmill opened on the far bank. More goods meant more wagons, and more wagons meant more business for the man who could bring order to the tangle. I knew that man had to be me, or else someone bolder would step in and push me aside. I began to dream of something larger than a stall, a true office, with shelves, ledgers, and a roof, strong enough to keep both rain and doubt out. Opportunity came through hardship. That spring, a merchant named Rollins lost half his stock when a driver abandoned a load of cloth in the rain. He stormed into my stall, cursing drivers and threatening to take his business elsewhere. I listened, then offered him a contract. Not a handshake, not a chalk mark, but a written agreement that my office would take full responsibility for his shipments in exchange for a steady fee. If drivers failed, I would pay. If goods were lost, I would cover the cost. It was bold, perhaps foolish, but Rollins, red-faced and desperate, signed. That single sheet of paper changed everything. Other merchants saw it and demanded the same. Within weeks, I had a stack of contracts in my box and the weight of responsibility on my shoulders. I had to be careful now, for one mistake could ruin me. But I also had leverage. Drivers who had once bargained freely now had to abide by my terms if they wanted steady work. I set schedules, issued receipts, and docked wages for delays. Some grumbled, but most stayed, for they knew I had the merchant's trust, and trust meant steady coin. With the contracts came real money. For the first time, I had enough to think beyond survival. I rented a larger space near the square, with 2 rooms and a sturdy door. The front held the slate board and Thomas's desk. The back I kept for myself, a place to store records and meet merchants in private. When I first sat at that desk, the wood smooth under my hands. I felt as though I had stepped into a new life, yet I also felt the burden. A farmer may worry about weather, but a man in my chair worries about every wagon, every road, every driver's honesty. Sleep grew thinner in those days. Partnerships tested me as much as floods ever did. A wealthy man named Callahan approached me with an offer. He had wagons and horses, but no system. I had a system, but not enough wagons. He proposed we join forces, splitting the profits. His smile was broad, his voice honeyed. Many in town respected him, though whispers said he squeezed debtors until they broke. I weighed the offer for a week, pacing the floor at night. In the end, I declined. My father's voice echoed in my head. Work hard, keep your word. A man like Callahan kept his word only when it suited him. I chose the slower road of buying wagons myself, coin by coin, rather than risk being yoked to his hunger. Still, I could not do everything alone. I began to lend small sums to trusted drivers so they could maintain their wagons in return for loyalty. One man used my coin to buy a stronger horse, another to repair a cracked axle. They repaid me over time, not with interest, but with steady work and priority for my contracts. Some might have called it charity. I called it investment in the backbone of my business. The first true wealth I touched came not from freight, but from foresight. One summer, I noticed that merchants often delayed shipments of grain until prices rose in autumn. This left wagons idle in the hottest months. I struck a deal with a miller upriver to carry his flour in those idle weeks at a discount. When autumn came, I already had drivers warmed and wagons seasoned, while others scrambled to find help. My office became the first place merchants turned, and I charged fair but firm rates. The profit that season was more than I had earned in all the years before. With profit came temptation. I could have moved into a finer house, bought better clothes, sat in taverns with the wealthy men. But each time I felt the itch. I remembered the winter of my childhood when we burned chairs for heat. I remembered the flood that nearly ruined me. I kept my life modest and poured my gains back into the business. A new wagon here, a stronger lockbox there, another clerk when Thomas grew overwhelmed. Growth was no longer a dream scribbled in a notebook. It was a structure rising brick by brick, sturdy enough to hold weight. Yet success drew envy. Rivals muttered that I cheated drivers, that I played favorites, that my contracts were a trap. Once, someone even painted a crude word across my stall door in tar. I scrubbed it off before sunrise and said nothing. I learned then that the higher you climb, the more stones are thrown. But if your foundation is strong, the stones cannot topple you. By the close of that year, I had more than coins in my box. I had a reputation that stretched beyond town. Merchants from neighboring villages sent word ahead, asking if my office could handle their goods. Drivers seeking work introduced themselves by name, hoping for a place on my slate. I stood in my larger office one evening, the lamplight catching the neat rows of ledgers, and I realized I was no longer the boy chasing coins on muddy roads. I was building something lasting, something that could outlive me. Still, I felt restless. Money was coming, yes. But wealth is more than coin. Wealth is land, permanence, a place that cannot be swept away by flood or fire. My mind turned toward that thought more and more as the year wore on. Perhaps the time had come to put down roots as deep as the oak trees on my father's farm. The first time I set foot on land I might truly call my own. The soil clung to my boots and filled me with a feeling I had not known before. It was not pride alone, nor relief. but something quieter, steadier, as if the earth itself whispered, "You belong here now." I had spent years moving goods, managing men, juggling coins, but all of it felt like water slipping through my fingers. Land was different. It stayed. It could not vanish in a flood or burn like a ledger. It was the root of permanence, and I knew in my heart that without roots, even the tallest tree will topple. I bought my first plot just outside town. A modest stretch with a small house and a few outbuildings that leaned as if weary from years of storms. The price was dear, but I had saved long, and I paid in honest coin. The seller, an aging farmer with no sons, clasped my hand and said, "Take care of her. She's seen both famine and feast." I promised I would. That night, I slept under a sagging roof, the wind whistling through cracks in the boards. But I slept with a peace I had not known since boyhood. For the first time, I was not a tenant, not a renter, not a guest. I was a man on his own ground. Owning land changed me in ways I did not expect. My office still rang with the bell each morning, and contracts still filled my desk. But in the evenings, I walked my fields. I felt the soil between my fingers, studied the way the sun fell across the grass, listened to the frogs in the marsh after rain. It reminded me of my father, bent over rows of corn, and of the vow I had made as a boy to rise above poverty. I had risen, yes, but now I saw that rising is not enough. One must also root, or else the climb has no meaning. Wealth brought comfort, but also new trials. My mother and father grew old on their farm, and when word reached me that my father's health was failing, I rode for days to see him. He was thinner than I remembered, his hands still calloused but trembling. He smiled weakly when I told him of the office, the contracts, the land. "You've done well, son," he whispered. "Better than me." I shook my head and told him I had only walked the road he had shown, that hard work and a kept word were the compass he had given me. He passed not long after, and though grief weighed me down, I found strength in the thought that I had kept the vow I once made by firelight in our broken home. I brought my mother to live with me then. She sat by the window of the small house on my land, sewing as she had all her life, though her eyes were dim. She often told me that the greatest wealth is not coin or soil, but the peace of knowing your family will not starve. I believed her. Each time I saw her take bread from my oven or warm herself by my fire, I felt richer than any merchant with gold in his chest. But fortune is never pure sweetness. One year, a sickness swept through town. Drivers fell ill, merchants shuttered their shops, and fear hung heavier than smoke. My office stood nearly empty, the slate board bare, the bell silent. For months I watched my earnings drain away while tending to neighbors and caring for my mother, who grew weak with fever but recovered by grace. That season taught me again that wealth can vanish in the blink of an eye, but character remains. Many remembered later that I shared wood, food, and medicine when I could. Those acts brought no coin, yet they returned to me in trust and loyalty when trade resumed. In time, the town recovered, and so did my fortunes. By then, I owned several plots of land, modest but steady. I built a larger home, not grand, but strong and warm. I married a kind woman named Sarah, whose laughter filled the rooms more than any fine furniture ever could. Together, we raised children who ran barefoot in the fields and learned early what it meant to work, to share, and to dream. Watching them grow, I often thought of the boy I once was. The boy who walked down a dirt road with nothing but bread in a bundle and a vow in his heart. I wanted my children to know hunger only as a word, not as a shadow at the table. In the later years, I stepped back from the daily bustle of the freight office. Younger men I had trained and trusted, took up the chalk and the contracts. I spent more time on the land, teaching my sons to plow straight rows, showing my daughters how to keep accounts with care and honesty. The office had built my fortune, but the land and my family were the wealth I cherished most. Now, as I write these words with hands that tremble from age, I see my life not as a tale of riches, but as a journey of lessons. I learned that hardship carves strength into the bones. I learned that failure, though bitter, is the finest teacher. I learned that trust, once earned, is a treasure greater than gold. And I learned that true wealth is not measured in coins or acres alone, but in the peace of a full belly, the warmth of a steady fire, and the laughter of loved ones close at hand. If I could speak to that boy I once was, shivering in the winter when the crops failed and the coal was gone, I would tell him this: keep walking. The road will be hard, the nights long, the burdens heavy. But each step you take with honesty and persistence will build a life stronger than you can imagine. The hunger in your belly will one day become the fire that lights your path. And when you are old, you will look back, not with regret, but with gratitude, for every struggle that shaped you, for every kindness that carried you, for every lesson that turned hardship into fortune. And that, my friend, is the story of my life. Not the tale of a wealthy man, but of an ordinary one who learned that fortune is built on faith, sweat, and the steady beating of a heart that never gives up.